Glass exploded across the high table. Blood and plum wine ran together. My stepmother froze. Everyone froze. But he didn't look at her. He looked at me. The crystal goblet exploded. Glass bit deep into the sovereign's bare palm. Hot blood mixed with plum wine. It splattered against the polished mahogany, staining the wood dark. Conversation died instantly. The clinking of silver forks stopped. A heavy, terrified silence fell over the vaulted hall. My stepmother's painted fingernails hovered in the air. She had just snapped them at me, a sharp, loud demand for fresh wine in front of 100 staring aristocrats. She waited for my shoulders to cave. She wanted the soot-stained servant to cower. I locked my knees instead. I held my chin perfectly level. The woman was a fool. She couldn't smell the ozone and frost clinging to my clothes. She had no idea the monster sitting at the head of the high table had already marked my pulse. Carved oak shrieked against the granite floor. He stood. The ambient chatter was entirely gone. The only sound left was the sickening drip of blood and wine hitting the floorboards. A heavy, scarred finger pointed directly at the puddle. "You made a mess." His chest rumbled, the low vibration rattling the silver plates on the table. "Get on your knees and scrub." His stare never left my stepmother's face. The arrogant flush drained from her cheeks, leaving behind pale, sweating skin. He wasn't talking to me. His uninjured hand slid around my waist. He pulled me backward, anchoring my spine flush against the cold steel of his armor. Chapter 1. Granite tore at Elina's knees. She plunged her cracked hands into the iron bucket. Lye water bit into her open cuts, smelling of caustic ash. She dragged stiff bristles across the slick courtyard stones. "Keep your head down. Stay invisible. Keep Toby safe in the cellar." A leather boot caught her ribs. "Clean it again." The guard's shadow blocked the moonlight. Elina swallowed a gasp. Blood pooled against her teeth. She gripped the brush handle. Retaliation just brought more bruises. Then the iron gates buckled inward. Rusted hinges snapped. A massive form crashed into the courtyard. Flagstones cracked under the impact. Guards scrambled backward, steel rasping from scabbards. The intruder thrashed on the frost. His gouged plate armor ground against the stone. Iron gauntlets clawed at his own scalp, before a ragged roar tore from his throat. The feral blood madness. Kaelin, the mad sovereign of the northern wastes. He rolled onto his side, blind gold irises locked onto Elina. Iron-clad fingers dug into the freezing mud. He dragged his massive weight closer. Elina scrambled backward. Her spine hit the stone well. He collapsed at her bare feet. A scarred cheek pressed into the wet hem of her dress. The frantic clatter of retreating guards died away. Elina listened to the quiet rush of her own blood. The sharp scent of adrenaline settled into the mud. A shuddering exhale plumed in the cold air between them. The reek of lye faded. An armored hand lashed out. Steel clamped around her wrist. The grip was an absolute vice. He lifted his head. The wild gold in his eyes crystallized into sudden clarity. "Ha, mine!" He yanked her into the mud. His teeth grazed her throat, resting right over her racing pulse.
3 grueling days of travel dragged Kaelin's mind from the frozen mud to the suffocating opulence of the estate. Now, he sat perfectly still in the study. For the first time in 3 years, the deafening storm inside his skull had fallen quiet. He listened to the hearth fire snap. It was just heat, dry parchment, and the smell of sour wine. He looked across the room. Elina stood braced against the oak paneling in the shadowed corner. Her chin lifted in quiet defiance, though a fine tremor shook her exhausted frame. The scent of vanilla and rain cut through the stale air. It anchored him. Kaelin dragged the parchment across the mahogany desk. His fingertips smeared the fresh ink. His signature surrendered vital northern trade routes and a staggering fortune in solid gold to the smirking woman across from him. The wealth meant nothing. Oh, it was a hollow sacrifice to keep his mind intact for the coming war. The stepmother snatched the quill from the inkwell with a grating laugh. "You trade a king's ransom for the rented stray? Take her. She's useless to me anyway." A low rumble vibrated against his ribs. He forced it down. Any display of genuine obsession would hand this miserable woman a weapon. He had no desire to claim a sudden mate. Dragging a gentle creature into his blood-soaked existence turned his stomach. He rose slowly from the velvet chair. Heavy silver clasps clinked as he unfastened his fur cloak. He crossed the rug with deliberate, silent steps. Elina's jaw tightened. She braced her spine against the wall, her knuckles stark white. He dropped the massive fur over her shivering shoulders. The thick material swallowed her frame, drowning out the stepmother's mocking stare. "Burn her rags." His voice was low. "She leaves with absolutely nothing from this pathetic rot." He turned his back on the room. A massive hand hovered inches from Elina's spine, guiding her toward the door. As they crossed the threshold, his calloused fingers brushed the nape of her neck. He felt the rapid, terrified thrum of blood beneath her skin, and kept his hand right there.
The brutal ride north ended in the heavy slam of the warlord's fortress doors. Inside the bedroom, the heat of the hearth closed around Elina's throat. She stood frozen on a thick woven rug. Her bare toes curled into the wool. She knew how to survive winter frost. She knew hollow hunger, and she knew the sharp bite of a leather belt. This quiet luxury felt like a snare. The warlord stepped in front of the heavy oak door. He turned the iron key. Click. The lock echoed through the dead wing of the fortress. Metal clattered against wood as he stripped his armor, letting the iron plates hit the floorboards. When he turned, the firelight caught the jagged silver scars tracking across his broad back. He pointed a calloused finger at the massive mattress. "Bed." His voice scraped like rusted iron. Panic flared in her chest. But she bypassed the pristine sheets entirely and dropped to the rug. Her knees hit the floor with a dull thud. She tucked her chin to her chest, bracing her spine. A stray expected the back of a hand. She would take the strike without a single sound. A harsh exhale cut through the room. Heavy footsteps crossed the stone. Kaelin grabbed a long velvet bolster. He hurled it down the exact center of the mattress, carving a strict dividing line. Amber eyes pinned her to the floor. "Get up." He waited until she flinched, then pointed at the right side of the bed. "I take the left, you take the right. Do not cross the velvet." A muscle feathered along his sharp jawline. "The madness runs deep in my blood." "Keep to your side, or you won't survive the night." The mattress groaned under his massive weight. He lay down and turned his scarred back to her. Elina crawled onto the far right edge of the bed. The freezing silk against her bruised legs felt like river water. She coiled into a tight defensive knot, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the apex predator. The heavy scent of dark pine drifted from his side of the mattress. It was grounding. Real. She kept her wide eyes on the velvet bolster. On the other side lay the most lethal force in the northern wastes. He didn't move. His breathing steadied into a slow, heavy rhythm against the quiet dark. Moonlight crept across the floorboards. Eventually, pure physical exhaustion dragged her under. She missed the moment his weight shifted. In the dark, a scarred hand slid silently across the velvet divide, hovering mere inches from her throat.
Jasmine and damp earth. The scent drifted across the mattress, quietly stripping away the control Kaelin fought so hard to keep. He stared blindly at the stone canopy above. A thin strip of velvet was the only thing stopping him from dragging her against his chest. The feral urge to kill was gone. Now, he just lay in the dark, sweating through a quiet war against the need to press his mouth to her pulse. He needed the physical boundary. The monster in his marrow didn't understand restraint. Once he touched her, he wouldn't stop. He remembered shattering solid oak war tables with his bare knuckles. She was made of glass. The silk sheets rustled. Kaelin turned his head. Elina thrashed wildly against the mattress. A broken, breathless whimper punched through the absolute silence of the room. A night terror. Instinct bypassed conscious thought. His hand breached the velvet divide. He needed to anchor her. His calloused fingertips grazed the trembling knuckles resting on the sheets. Instantly, her small fingers locked around his heavy thumb. A vice grip. The frantic whimpering died. Her erratic breathing smoothed out, sinking with the steady quiet of the room. A harsh jolt of heat traveled up his armored forearm. The alpha bowed his heavy head against the pillow. Kaelin closed his eyes, letting the desperate pressure of her grip pull him straight into sleep. Dawn broke gray and freezing. The silk sheets beside him were empty. The mattress was ice. Adrenaline spiked. Kaelin kicked the heavy furs aside and sat up. Scrape, scrape. A rhythmic scratching echoed from the far corner. Stiff bristles dragging against stone. His stare whipped toward the entrance. Elina knelt on the freezing floorboards. Her knuckles were split and bleeding. She frantically scrubbed the already spotless stone. Cold ash coated Kaelin's lungs. She was trying to buy her right to exist. Whoever had her before had taken a defiant survivor and broken her down into jagged pieces. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he crossed the room. She froze. Her spine went rigid when his massive shadow fell over her. His knee hit the stone right beside her. Calloused fingers wrapped firmly around her bleeding wrist. Enough. He pried the brush from her torn hand.
The routine was a numb blur. Wake up, scrub, stay invisible. Elina was on her knees in the library. The sharp scent of lemon oil stung her nose. Scrub, rinse, dry. She dragged the stiff boar-bristle brush across the oak, keeping her head down. Toby's survival depended on her silence. A shadow fell over her hands. A heavy boot blocked her path. Elina stopped. The visiting warlord stood between her and the hearth. He smelled of stale wine and unwashed skin. Careful. He nudged her scrubbing hand with his toe. Your rented stray is bleeding on the pristine floor. Elina's knuckles locked tight around the brush. Her spine went rigid. She reached for the rag, but her fingers were slick with sweat and soap. Her hand bumped the heavy crystal inkwell sitting on the low table. Slide, tip, smash. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her black ink exploded across the floorboards. It sprayed over her torn fingers and soaked into the hem of her grey wool dress. Elina stopped breathing. The air left the room. The stain was spreading. It looked like a bruise on the wood. Terror. It seized her lungs. She wasn't in the fortress anymore. She was back in the cellar, waiting for the punishment. The library doors didn't just open. They slammed against the stone walls. Kaelin filled the doorway. He stood frozen, his chest heaving beneath dark, oiled leather. His burning amber gaze locked instantly on the black puddle. Then, on her shaking hands. The visiting lord scrambled backward, his gold chains rattling. Sovereign, Elina squeezed her eyes shut. She tucked her chin to her chest and curled her ruined hands over her stomach. She knew how this went. Nay, a stray knows how to take a beating. Clench the jaw, don't make a sound. Heavy boots crossed the floor. 2 terrifying strides. She braced for the strike. It never came. A large, calloused hand clamped onto her shoulder. It wasn't a strike. His fingers slid up her neck, pressing firmly against her pulse, checking the frantic rhythm of her heart.
He smelled it before he even cleared the archway. Terror. It hit Kalen's senses, sharp and sour. He kicked the oak doors open, the oxygen in his lungs replaced instantly by cold rage. Elina was on the floor. She was kneeling in a pool of black ink, shivering. Her knuckles were bleeding against the wood. And the visiting lord was standing by the fire, choking back a laugh. The world narrowed down to a single point of focus. Kalen didn't draw the steel sword at his hip. He didn't need it. He crossed the library in silence. The lord turned, smile fading. Kalen lashed out. His hand twisted into the man's heavy gold chains. Metal links dug into sweating neck skin. With a single heave, Kalen lifted the man a full foot off the floor. He walked the thrashing weight to the corridor and hurled him onto the cold stone. And the lord landed in a heap of velvet and panic. "Look at her again," Kalen said. His voice was a low vibration in the floorboards. "Look at her again, and I take your eyes." He slammed the door. Silence rushed back into the room. Heavy, thick. Kalen turned. Elina hadn't moved. She was trying to hide her blackened hands against her chest, bracing for an eruption of violence. He walked toward her. Crunch. His boots pulverized the shattered glass of the inkwell. He didn't stop until he reached the center of the mess. Then, completely ignoring the ink, Kalen dropped to his knees. His expensive leather armor soaked up the black liquid instantly. Elina flinched. He reached out. Gently, his iron-hard fingers pried the stiff brush from her locked grip. He stood up, walked to the fireplace, and threw the brush into the roaring flames. When the bristles caught fire with a hiss, he returned to her. The floorboards groaned as he knelt back down. He refused to tower over her. Elina was still staring at her ruined hands, hyperventilating. Kalen did the only thing that would make sense to her. He placed his own massive hands flat on the floor. He pressed his palms directly into the puddle of black ink. He turned his wrists, coating his skin, intentionally ruining himself to match her. Elina's eyes snapped up, wide, terrified, shocked. She looked at his hands, then his face. "No one in my territory kneels," Kalen said. The tone was dark, but the command was grounding. "Especially not you." He reached out with ink-drenched fingers and wrapped them around her shaking hands. He pulled her bleeding knuckles up to his face and pressed his mouth against the copper and the ink.
The stifling heat finally broke, trading the heavy afternoon for a violent storm. Lightning flashed white against the armory windows. Freezing rain lashed the glass. Elina sat deep in the wooden window seat, her bare heels dug into the grain. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on her bruised collarbone. Crash. Thunder rolled over the keep. It sounded too much like the heavy thud of leather boots on stone. Her throat tightened. A scream tore through the armory. Kalen hit the stone floor. His massive frame crashed directly into a rack of broadswords, sending heavy steel clattering across the masonry. His broad shoulders convulsed. The feral shift was taking him by force. The brutal sound of bone grinding against bone echoed in the large room. Dark fur forced its way through the skin of his throat. His reinforced leather gauntlets tore as claws extended from his fingertips. To him, the thunder wasn't a storm. It was a battlefield. Elina didn't run for the oak doors. She slid off the window seat, bypassing the safety of the iron tables. Her bare knees hit the freezing stone right beside him. She remembered Toby shivering in the dirt. She knew how to handle terror. She reached into the mess of fur and muscle. Her small hands clamped firmly over his sharply pointed ears, physically sealing out the thunder. She leaned in, pressing her throat inches from his lengthening fangs. "Hush now. The dark night is just sleeping." She kept her voice steady, letting the vibration press against his jaw. Hush now. The bright sun will come soon. A ragged gasp ripped from his mouth. The grinding sound returned as the shift reversed. A bone snapped backward. Claws retracted into torn cuticles. Amber eyes snapped open, locking onto her face. The fur receded, leaving behind flushed, sweating skin. Outside, another crack of thunder shook the glass. But inside, the armory was completely still. The smell of ozone faded into the damp chill of the room. Kaelin stopped thrashing. He just stared up at her. Elina kept her hands over his ears, letting her thumbs trace the hammering, frantic rhythm of his pulse.
The noise was breaking him apart. Thunder cracked, but all Kaelin heard was artillery fire. It rang against his eardrums and choked his lungs with the smell of burning ozone. He bit down hard on the inside of his cheek. The sharp taste of hot copper flooded his mouth, giving him one real, grounded thing to hold onto against the pain. He was drowning in it. The beast was pulling him under into a blind rage. Then, the pressure vanished. Small, warm palms clamped over his ringing ears. The catastrophic warfare in his head went instantly, beautifully mute. The scent of rain and soap filled his lungs. A soft vibration hummed against his jaw. A voice. It cut through the storm and pulled his shattered mind back to the stone floor. Kaelin opened his eyes. The blur slowly sharpened into Elina. She was kneeling on the freezing masonry, holding his head. She didn't flinch from his blood-stained mouth. She didn't run. She just gripped him. Her lips were inches from his scarred mouth. Her frantic, shallow breath fanned across his jaw. The urge to drag her against his armored chest hit him like a physical blow. He needed to consume the only quiet thing in his violent world. His hand trembled as he lifted it from the stone. His rough, blood-stained fingertips brushed a damp curl of dark hair behind her ear. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. Her chest rose and fell fast. She watched the heavy line of his mouth. Time hung suspended in the damp air between them. Then, reality crashed back down, suffocating him. He was a butcher. He broke things for a living. If he stayed on this floor with her, his obsession would snap her fragile bones. Kaelin surged to his feet. He turned his broad back on her and walked straight for the exit. He left her kneeling on the cold stone. Clang. The heavy iron door shut behind him. Click. The lock turned.
The storm broke overnight, leaving only the biting cold. Sunlight hit the leaded glass windows but offered no heat. The dining hall was freezing. Elina leaned her aching hips against the long mahogany table. The smell of roasted venison and spiced bread drifted from the kitchens, but it only turned her empty stomach into a tight knot. She couldn't eat. She picked up a linen cloth, rub, polish, shine. She dragged the fabric over a heavy silver goblet. The sharp clinking of the metal gave her something to focus on. A valley in the quiet. It reminded her of Toby, sitting in the dirt, scrubbing a rusted iron spoon against his mud-soaked trousers until it gleamed. Heavy iron boots struck the corridor stones. The silver goblet slipped from her hand. It clattered violently against the wood. Elina immediately dropped her chin to her collarbone. Kaelin filled the archway. He wore dark steel. The heavy buckles of his armor clinked as he stopped exactly 10 feet away. His jaw was locked tight. The gentle, grounding man from the armory was gone. The brutal northern warlord had returned. He didn't look at her. "I ride for the western border." His voice was gravel and absolute authority. "Skirmishes. They require my steel." Elina's lungs clamped shut. He was leaving. A muscle jumped along his jawline. "I doubled your guard detail. Remain in this wing." He paused, the silence stretching between them. "This is a blood contract, Elina. Purely transactional. Acknowledge the mandate." The walls of her reality slammed back into place. A rented stray knew her exact value. She dipped her chin in silent submission. The heavy oak doors banged open. A sweating scout sprinted into the hall, his chest heaving. He held out a heavy parchment scroll. The black wax bore a twisting serpent seal. Elina went completely numb. "Sovereign," the scout gasped. Vespera's carriage crossed the main river. She arrives by nightfall for the treaty. The blood drained from Elina's face. Her fingers curled into the mahogany edge. The architect of her nightmare was coming. She didn't freeze. Moving with quiet, terrifying precision, Elina reached across the table, grabbed a sharpened silver steak knife, and slid the cold blade straight up her woolen sleeve.
The courtyard wind felt like razors. Kalen gripped his leather reins. The sharp smell of wet earth and sweating horses filled the air, but it wasn't enough to ground him. Infantry scrambled through the freezing mud, loading broadswords and provisions. Kalen just stared blindly at his saddle. The beast beneath his skin clawed at his ribs. It refused to leave the keep. It wanted the girl. But Kalen remembered the armory. He remembered how easily his feral madness could have crushed her. Every step away from her tore at his chest, but he needed the distance. He had to leave before he broke her. He yanked the saddle straps viciously tight. He tested the iron buckles. He shoved his blade into its scabbard. He needed the physical labor. If he didn't keep his hands busy, he would tear the keep doors off their hinges and go back to her room. But the infantry captain marched through the mud and stopped beside him. The scarred man watched his sovereign's erratic breathing. "Sovereign," the captain said quietly. "The border skirmish is nothing. My infantry can handle it. You don't need to ride." Kalen swallowed hard. It tasted like ash. "I ride for the perimeter." The rumble in Kalen's chest vibrated through his armor. "You command the interior guard. Plant yourself outside her door. If a single shadow touches her, I will burn this fortress down with you inside it." Boots slapped against the wet cobblestone. The sweating scout practically crashed into Kalen's horse. He shoved the wax-sealed parchment upward. Kalen snatched it. His heavy thumb cracked the black serpent seal. He read the ink. Vespera had crossed the boundary line. The woman who broke his anchor was coming, but the architect of Elina's trauma was walking right into his territory. Kalen crushed the heavy paper in his fist and threw it into the mud. He let go of the reins. The beast didn't just claw at his ribs anymore. It took over completely. A sovereign does not abandon his mate to a predator. He drew his heavy steel broadsword from its scabbard. The metal hissed in the cold air. Kalen turned his back on the warhorse and stalked toward the heavy keep doors. He was going to paint the floorboards red.
The dusk fell over the fortress. The shadows in the corridor were long and cold. Elina gripped the glass vial. Inside, purple liquid sloshed against the crystal. Even through the stopper, the smell of bitter earth burned her throat. Wolfsbane. She could still feel Vespera's fingers on her windpipe from the garden. The ultimatum was simple. Poison the sovereign, or Toby goes to the hounds. Elina made her choice. She pushed the heavy oak doors open. Kalen stood by the mahogany map table. Candlelight caught the edges of his dark leather armor. He looked up, his golden glare landing on her instantly. Elina didn't walk to him. She dropped. Her knees hit the polished floorboards with a dull thud. She dragged herself forward across the wood until she reached the table. Clack! She slammed the crystal vial down onto the map. She told me to kill you." Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "She said Toby dies tonight unless you drink this." Kalen went perfectly still. He turned to iron. Elina tucked her chin to her chest, exposing the back of her neck. She braced her spine. She was trading her life for the truth. "Send your infantry. Get Toby out." Tears hot and fast tracked down her cheeks. "Save him. Then you can take my head." She pressed her forehead against the floorboards. She waited for the strike. She waited for the whistle of steel. It never came. Heavy boots scraped across the floor. A wall of heat surrounded her. The scent of ozone and leather filled her lungs. Rough, calloused fingers tangled into her hair. A sharp tug jerked her chin up. "Look at me!" She stared into the terrified gold heat of his eyes.
The smell hit Kaelin before she even spoke. Wolfsbane. It sucked the oxygen out of the war room. He stared at the vial resting on his maps. The purple liquid shimmered in the candlelight. The monster under his skin slammed against his ribs. But the rage wasn't for the girl on the floor. It was for the architect of the trap. Elina was curled against the wood, waiting for him to kill her. She had bypassed her own survival. She had walked in here and handed him the weapon meant to end his life, just to buy a chance for her brother. Kaelin didn't reach for his broadsword. He dropped to his knees. He ignored the dignity of his station. He dragged her fragile body off the floorboards and pulled her into his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of sugar and storm to clear the wolfsbane from his head. "You think I would hurt you?" His voice was a low vibration against her ribs. "I will never let a blade touch your skin." She sobbed against his leather plating. Her knuckles were white, locking onto his armor like she was drowning. Kaelin reached blindly under the map table. He found the iron lockbox and snapped the latch with his thumb. He pulled out a rolled parchment and shoved it into her shaking hands. "Read it." What is this?" Her voice was a ghost. "A decree," Kaelin said. He watched the terror slowly drain from her face. "Toby is legally mine. My riders extracted him 2 days ago. He is safe behind my walls." A gasp tore from her throat. The tension left her spine, and she slumped against him. She was safe. The boy was safe. Now Kaelin needed to hunt. He surged to his feet. Crash. He kicked the massive mahogany map table. The solid wood flipped over, sending heavy iron swords and the vial of poison shattering against the stone floor. The sound rang in the silence. Kaelin ignored the destruction. He reached down and locked his hand around Elina's wrist. "Get up." He pulled her to her feet. "We march for the banquet hall." A lethal smile curved his jaw. "The wicked stepmother bleeds tonight."
The war room was a quiet sanctuary. The banquet hall was a battlefield. The massive oak doors groaned open. The glare from 100 crystal chandeliers hit Elina's face. The chatter of the nobility died instantly. The room smelled of roasted garlic, spun honey, and overripe plum wine. It made her stomach turn. She kept her eyes forward. Toby was safe in the inner keep. He was far away from the vultures sitting in this room. Kaelin offered his armored forearm. The dark steel was freezing against the midnight blue silk his tailors had draped her in. Heavy velvet crushed her waist. Silver chains rested against her collarbone. It was a gilded cage, but she gripped his arm to keep her hands from shaking. They walked down the red carpet. Aristocrats stared at the dark bruises fading on her jaw. Whispers hissed from behind painted fans. Elina scanned the high table. Vespera sat in the dead center. She wore crimson silk that looked exactly like wet blood. Her dark eyes locked onto Elina. A sneer twisted her painted lips. Vespera pushed her heavy wooden chair back. It scraped loudly against the stone. "Look at you." Her voice cut through the silence like a whip. "You dressed her nicely, Sovereign, but expensive silk cannot hide the rot underneath." Elina's heart slammed against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't in the fortress anymore. She was back in the dirt. Vespera was ripping a handmade dress from her bleeding back while the village laughed. Vespera held out an empty crystal goblet. "Fetch me a drink, Stray, now." Muscle memory bypassed Elina's rational brain. Terror erased the present. She lunged forward. I reaching blindly for the heavy silver pitcher on the table. Obedience meant survival. A calloused hand clamped around her wrist. Iron-hard fingers pulled her arm back, pinning it firmly against a steel-plated hip.
Kaylin smelled her terror before she even moved. It cut straight through the heavy aroma of roasted meat and plum wine, sharp and sour. He looked at the woman sitting at his table. Vespera. She was smiling, feeding on the panic of the girl beside him. The beast beneath Kaylin's skin didn't roar. It went dead quiet. He stepped forward. He eclipsed Elina entirely, putting his dark steel between her shaking frame and the crowd. The temperature in the hall plummeted. The aristocrats froze in their carved wooden chairs. Fans stopped waving. Even the armed infantry took a slow, deliberate half-step back against the granite walls. Kaylin didn't reach for the silver pitcher. He reached for Vespera. His hand bypassed the wine and closed entirely over the crystal goblet while it was still in her hand. Vespera's arrogant sneer faltered. She looked up at the towering shadow. Her breathing hitched, shallow and frantic. "You think she is a stray," Kaylin said. His voice was a low scrape of gravel that carried easily to the back of the silent room. "You think she pours your wine." He closed his fist. Crunch. He crushed the goblet. Shattered crystal and hot blood rained across the pristine mahogany. The sickening sound of glass and bone echoed in the vast hall. Nobody moved. Nobody took a breath. The sickly, sweet smell of plum wine vanished. The sharp, metallic sting of fresh blood took its place.
The crack of crystal tore through the room. Shards drove deep into Kaylin's bare fist. Hot blood mixed with plum wine. It dripped. Heavy, wet drops splattered against the mahogany table, sliding down to pool on the stone floor. The vaulted hall went entirely dead. Vespera scrambled backward. Her silk heels slipped on the freezing stone. Her spine hit a heavy wooden chair with a loud thud. The arrogant flush vanished from her painted face. Kaylin didn't shout. He extended one blood-soaked finger toward the puddle. "You made a mess." The low rumble carried easily to the back of the silent room. "Kneel on the stone, scrub." Two infantrymen broke from the shadows. Armored gauntlets clamped down on crimson silk. They forced the aristocrat to her knees. They shoved her face toward the puddle. The expensive fabric of her dress soaked up the dark ruin. Elina let out a long, shaky breath. The cold terror that had lived in her bones for years finally dissolved. She watched the woman weeping on the stone. She would never bow to her again. Down the corridor, heavy iron hinges groaned. Fast, frantic footsteps slapped across the stone. A mud-streaked boy skidded into the doorway. "Elina!" She dropped to the floor. Midnight silk pooled around her knees as Toby crashed into her chest. She buried her face in his messy hair. He smelled like rain and dirt. He was warm. He was safe. When she finally lifted her head, she looked straight at the warlord. She locked her trembling fingers into Toby's collar. She met Kaylin's golden stare across the room, and she didn't look away.
The beast inside Kaylin went absolutely still. He watched Elina shield the boy against her silk dress. A few feet away, Vespera wept against the floorboards, scrubbing the blood with her bare hands. Kaylin ignored the aristocrat. His focus remained entirely on the girl. He needed the room to understand exactly what she was. Heavy steel clanked against the stone. Kaylin dropped his massive frame down onto a single knee. A sharp gasp rippled through the hall. The aristocrat stared in dead silence. The northern sovereign knelt for no one. His voice cut through the room. "The contract is void." He swept his gaze across the terrified nobility. "She is no stray. She serves no one. She is mine." He turned back to Elina. He reached out. His blood-stained fingers were incredibly careful as they tilted her chin upward. The sweet scent of rain and vanilla filled his lungs, cutting through the sharp metallic sting of the banquet hall. The wolf beneath his skin demanded the claim. He leaned in. His teeth grazed the frantic pulse at her neck. He bit down into the warm flesh. Elina didn't flinch. A broken exhale brushed against his jaw. Her small fingers tangled into his hair. She pulled him closer, anchoring herself to the pain. Kaelin pulled back just enough to see it. He traced the fresh, darkening mark on her throat. He stood, sweeping her fragile body off the floorboards. He carried her toward the heavy oak doors. His thumb pressed firmly over the bite, sealing the claim in blood.